Long winters did not begin suddenly. They arrived gradually, almost without notice, as the days shortened and the light softened. For communities living far north, this change was not unexpected. It returned each year in familiar ways, following patterns that had been observed for generations. There was no sense of urgency when the light began to fade earlier in the day. It was simply part of the rhythm that shaped ordinary life. People adjusted slowly. They noticed the air cooling, the ground hardening, and the way sounds carried differently as snow began to settle. These observations were not dramatic. They were quiet acknowledgments that time was moving forward, just as it always had. Daily routines continued with small changes rather than sudden shifts. Homes became more central as the season progressed. People spent longer periods indoors, not because they were forced to, but because it felt natural. The interior spaces were familiar and carefully arranged. Objects were placed where they had always been, within easy reach, shaped by long use rather than deliberate design. Nothing needed to be reorganized all at once. Adjustments happened gradually, often without conscious thought. The act of staying warm was woven into daily life rather than treated as a separate concern. Clothing layers were added slowly. Materials that had been used for years were brought out again, softened by time and repeated handling. There was comfort in this familiarity. The body recognized what was needed and responded without hesitation. Light became something to notice more closely. As daylight shortened, interior light took on greater importance. Fires were tended carefully, not as a source of spectacle, but as a steady presence. Flames were kept low and controlled, offering warmth and gentle illumination. There was no desire for brightness. Soft light was enough, allowing the eyes to rest and the mind to remain calm. Daily tasks continued, though at a slower pace. Movement was deliberate and efficient. People conserved energy without needing to think about it. Tasks that could wait were allowed to wait. Time was not measured in minutes or hours, but in the steady progression of routine. The day unfolded quietly, shaped by habit rather than intention. Silence became more noticeable during these months, though it was never complete. The sound of wind moving across snow, the low crackle of fire, and the soft movements within shared spaces formed a constant background. These sounds were not distractions. They were signs that life was continuing, even as the world outside appeared still. Waiting was part of life during long winters, but it was not experienced as emptiness. Waiting was filled with small actions, familiar observations, and gentle repetition. People sat, worked, rested, and moved in patterns that had been practiced for years. There was no expectation that time needed to pass quickly. It simply needed to pass. Sleep came and went without strict boundaries. Rest periods shifted naturally, responding to darkness and quiet rather than to schedules. People slept when they felt tired and woke when their bodies were ready. These rhythms were flexible, adapting to the conditions of the season. Long winters were not something to overcome. There was something to live within. Each day resembled the one before it, not because life was stagnant, but because stability offered comfort. Repetition reduced uncertainty. Familiar routines provided reassurance. As the season deepened, life continued quietly, shaped by patience, observation, and the steady presence of community. Nothing needed to be rushed, nothing needed to be concluded. Winter simply remained, and people remained with it. As winter settled fully into place, the outside world became quieter and more uniform. Snow covered familiar landmarks, smoothing edges and softening contrast. Paths that had once been distinct blended into the surrounding landscape. Movement outdoors became slower, not because it was difficult, but because it required care and attention. Inside, daily life maintained its gentle rhythm. People occupied the same spaces for longer periods, sharing warmth and presence. Conversation was minimal and unforced. Silence was comfortable, allowing thoughts to drift without direction. There was no expectation that every moment needed to be filled. Food preparation took on a steady, predictable pattern. Meals relied on what had been gathered and preserved earlier. There was no sense of scarcity dominating the day. Instead, there was a quiet awareness of balance. Portions were measured naturally, guided by experience rather than calculation. Cooking was slow and deliberate. Heat was managed carefully, ensuring that warmth served multiple purposes. Fires provided light, warmth, and a place for food preparation all at once. Nothing was wasted. Each action served more than one role, creating efficiency without effort. Eating was calm and unhurried. Meals offered a pause within the day, a moment of shared stillness. People ate familiar foods in familiar ways, allowing the body to settle. There was no emphasis on variety or novelty. Consistency was valued, offering reassurance during long stretches of darkness. Clothing and coverings were adjusted throughout the day. Layers were added or removed as needed, responding to subtle changes in temperature. Materials were chosen for their reliability rather than appearance. Textures were familiar to the touch, shaped by years of use. Maintenance tasks filled quiet hours. Objects were checked, repaired, and returned to use. These activities were not treated as interruptions. They were part of the ongoing process of living within the season. Hands moved steadily, guided by habit and experience. Light continued to play a central role. As darkness extended across much of the day, interior spaces remained softly lit. There was no effort to replicate daylight. Instead, people adapted to lower light levels, allowing their senses to adjust naturally. The reduced brightness encouraged calm and rest. Rest itself was flexible. Sleep periods shifted in response to extended darkness. People rested more frequently, waking and sleeping without strict division. This pattern was not confusing or disruptive. It followed the natural signals of the body and the environment. Community provided quiet reassurance during this time. Simply knowing that others were nearby offered comfort. Shared presence reduced isolation, even when conversation was minimal. Life continued, collectively, shaped by mutual awareness rather than constant interaction. The long winter did not require constant attention. It existed as a backdrop rather than a challenge. Days passed quietly, each one similar to the last, yet never exactly the same. Small variations in light, sound, and activity created gentle differences within the overall sameness. Through patience and familiarity, people moved through the season without resistance. Winter did not need to end in order for life to continue. It simply needed to be lived within, one calm day at a time. As winter settled more fully into the landscape, daily life adjusted without resistance. The cold did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual presence that became part of everything. The air felt heavier, the ground grew firmer, sounds traveled differently, often sharper and clearer, carried across still distances. None of this was unexpected. It had happened before, many times, and would happen again. Movement during these months became deliberate. People did not hurry unless necessary. Energy was conserved through habit rather than instruction. Steps were steady. Gestures were smaller. Every motion had a familiar weight to it, shaped by long experience rather than conscious planning. Nothing about the pace felt unusual. It was simply the pace that fit the season. Indoors, spaces were arranged to support long periods of waiting. Objects were kept close. Tools were placed where they could be reached without unnecessary movement. Sitting and standing happened less often, replaced by longer stretches of stillness. The body learned how to remain comfortable without constant change. Light during winter hours behaved differently. It arrived briefly and left early, creating long intervals where darkness rested over the land. This darkness was not treated as absence. It was simply another condition, like wind or snow, something to move within rather than against. Activities adjusted to it quietly, without urgency. Voices were used sparingly. Conversation, when it happened, was soft and measured. Silence filled the spaces between words without discomfort. People listened more than they spoke, aware of subtle sounds that signaled presence nearby. The quiet was not empty. It was layered with small, familiar cues. Food preparation during winter followed steady patterns. Ingredients were chosen carefully, portions measured by experience rather than calculation. Meals were meant to sustain rather than surprise. Familiar flavors returned again and again, offering consistency through long stretches of time. Eating became another form of rhythm, marking hours without dividing them sharply. Between tasks, waiting became a common state. Waiting for light, waiting for warmth, waiting for weather to shift. This waiting was not anxious. It was practiced. Bodies rested while time passed, understanding that movement would return when it was needed. Outside, the landscape remained mostly unchanged from day to day. Snow reshaped surfaces slowly. Ice thickened quietly. These changes were observed without commentary. People noticed them because they mattered, not because they were remarkable. Attention stayed practical and calm. The winter did not ask to be overcome. It was endured by continuing, by repeating familiar actions, by allowing days to resemble one another closely. This sameness did not dull awareness. It sharpened it, drawing attention to small differences that mattered. And so life continued, steady and unremarkable, shaped by patience rather than urgency, carried forward through long, quiet hours. Inside sheltered spaces, warmth was managed carefully. Heat was never assumed. It was maintained through attention rather than effort. Small adjustments made a difference over long periods. Openings were minimized. Materials were layered. The goal was not comfort as later understood, but balance, enough warmth to remain still, enough air to breathe easily. People positioned themselves in ways that reduced movement, sitting close, resting near familiar sources of heat. The body learned where it felt most stable, where it could remain without tension. These positions became habitual, returned to again and again across the season. Clothing during winter months served as both protection and routine. Layers were added or removed slowly, guided by sensation rather than planning. Fabric softened with use. Seams and edges were checked quietly, maintained without urgency. Clothing was not changed often, but it was adjusted frequently, responding to subtle shifts in temperature. Time during these months felt different. Without strong markers of light and dark, days blended together gently. One day resembled the next closely. This repetition was not confusing. It was reassuring. It allowed attention to rest, freeing the mind from constant adjustment. Indoor activities filled long hours without emphasis. Simple tasks were repeated patiently. Hands moved through familiar motions. Objects were handled carefully, not because they were precious, but because replacing them would take effort. Care became a form of efficiency. Children and elders spent much of the winter indoors, sharing space without constant interaction. Presence alone provided comfort. Sounds of breathing, shifting, and quiet movement filled the background. These sounds confirmed that life continued nearby, steady and unchanged. Sleep during winter did not always follow a strict pattern. Rest came when it was possible. Waking happened naturally. People adapted to the rhythm of darkness, allowing sleep to arrive in segments rather than expecting it all at once. This flexibility was learned over time, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Outside sounds occasionally filtered in, wind moving across surfaces, snow settling, ice responding to changes in temperature. These sounds were noted briefly, then allowed to fade. They did not demand reaction unless they signaled something practical. Waiting remained a central part of life. Waiting was not separate from living. It was living. Waiting for light, waiting for weather, waiting for change. But Ease learned how to remain comfortable within this waiting, conserving energy and attention. The winter stretched on, not as an obstacle, but as a condition. People moved through it by continuing familiar routines, by adjusting gently rather than reacting sharply. Each day passed much like the one before, carrying life forward without interruption. And within this quiet repetition, life remained stable, held together by patience, familiarity, and the slow movement of time. As winter deepened, waiting became part of everyday life. Not waiting for a single event, but waiting as a condition that surrounded everything. Waiting for light to change, for wind to settle, for the next small task to feel possible. Time did not move quickly during these months. It stretched gently, shaped by darkness and quiet. Days were not counted forward with expectation. They simply continued, one after another, much like the snow that continued to fall without marking a beginning or an end. Inside living spaces, people adjusted to this slow passage of time. Movement became deliberate. Energy was used carefully, not out of fear, but out of habit formed over many winters. There was no need to rush when there was nowhere else to go. Stillness did not mean inactivity. Hands continued to work at small, familiar tasks, repairing tools, sorting materials, rearranging objects that had already been arranged many times before. These activities were not performed to reach a finished result. They were done to occupy time gently, to maintain rhythm, to keep the body engaged without strain. Repetition was comforting. The same motions returned again and again, creating a sense of continuity even as the world outside remained frozen and unchanged. The cold outside pressed steadily against the walls, but inside, the air remained calm. Warmth was contained, protected, allowed to settle. People learned to remain within this contained space, not resisting the limits of winter, but accepting them as part of the season. Waiting became a shared experience, not spoken about, not questioned. It was understood that winter required patience, and patience required stillness. There was no advantage in wishing the season away. Instead, attention stayed close to the present moment, the sound of breathing, the faint movement of fabric, the gentle shift of light when it appeared. In this way, winter was not something to endure aggressively. It was something to move alongside, slowly, carefully, allowing time to unfold at its own pace. As the long winter continued, closeness became a practical necessity rather than a social choice. People remained near one another, sharing warmth and space without comment. Distance was reduced naturally, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding. Living areas were arranged to hold heat efficiently. Bodies provided warmth simply by being present. There was no need for constant conversation. Silence filled the space comfortably, broken only by occasional movement or quiet sounds of daily activity. This closeness shaped how time was experienced. Moments blended together. Individual routines overlapped gently with those of others. There was little separation between personal and shared time. People learned to rest in this proximity, to sleep lightly, to wake and return to rest without disturbance. The presence of others became part of the background, steady and reassuring. Warmth was maintained through consistency rather than effort. Small adjustments were made throughout the day. Clothing shifted. Positions changed slightly. Heat was preserved rather than generated anew. The outside world remained distant during these months. Snow covered familiar landmarks. Paths disappeared. Movement beyond immediate surroundings was limited. Inside, however, life continued in quiet cycles, eating, resting, working slowly with hands, pausing often. These cycles repeated without variation, creating a sense of stability within the long stretch of winter. There was comfort in knowing what came next, even if what came next was simply more of the same. Shared warmth was not discussed or celebrated. It was simply part of how life functioned during this season, an unspoken agreement between people and the environment around them. As winter held its place, life held its own rhythm in return, steady, contained, and calm. As the long winter continued, much of daily life shifted inward, not suddenly, but gradually, as people adjusted to the conditions around them. Work still needed to be done, yet it took on a quieter form, shaped by limited light and close spaces. Inside shelters and homes, movements became smaller and more deliberate, guided by habit rather than urgency. Hands worked steadily, often on familiar tasks that returned again and again throughout the season. Tools were handled carefully, their shapes well known. There was no need to hurry. Time during winter did not move quickly, and neither did the people living within it. Tasks were repeated not to reach an ending, but to maintain balance and continuity. Much of this work involved maintenance rather than creation. Clothing was checked, adjusted, and repaired. Small tears were mended slowly, stitch by stitch, using materials already at hand. These actions required patience, but patience was already part of daily life. The work filled the hours gently, without drawing attention to itself. Inside these spaces, sound remained soft and contained. The quiet scrape of tools, the brushing of fabric, the low rhythm of breathing all blended together. Silence was not complete, yet nothing broke the calm. The environment encouraged focus without strain, allowing the body to remain relaxed while the hands continued their motions. People often worked side by side, not always interacting, but aware of one another's presence. This closeness did not require conversation. It was enough to share the space, to move carefully so as not to disturb the quiet. Over time, this shared stillness became familiar, offering comfort rather than confinement. The limited daylight shaped these routines as well. When light was available, it was used efficiently, but without pressure. When darkness returned, work continued by touch and memory. The body adapted naturally, learning to rely less on sight and more on repetition. These indoor routines repeated day after day, forming a steady rhythm within the long winter. They provided structure without demanding attention, allowing time to pass slowly and evenly. Life continued, not through dramatic action, but through quiet persistence, sustained by familiar movements and patient hands. Food during the long winter was approached with care and intention. Supplies gathered earlier in the year were used thoughtfully, not out of fear, but out of familiarity with the season's length. Meals were simple, consistent, and deeply tied to routine rather than variety. Preparation took place slowly, often in the same areas where warmth was most stable. Ingredients were handled carefully, portions measured by experience rather than calculation. There was no expectation of abundance, only the understanding that nourishment needed to last and to sustain the body steadily. Eating itself was calm and unhurried. Meals were moments of pause within the day, offering warmth and quiet comfort. People ate what they were accustomed to, in ways that felt familiar. The act of eating did not interrupt the rhythm of winter life. It blended into it. Warmth was maintained carefully as well. Heat sources were managed attentively, not constantly adjusted, but observed and supported. People learned to recognize subtle changes in temperature, responding gradually rather than urgently. Layers of clothing, shared spaces, and practiced habits all contributed to maintaining comfort. Much of winter involved waiting, though this waiting was not empty. It was filled with small actions, repeated observations, and steady presence. People became accustomed to time moving slowly, 2 days blending together without sharp distinctions. This pace was accepted rather than resisted. Waiting did not mean inactivity. It meant allowing life to continue without pushing forward unnecessarily. The body adjusted to this rhythm, conserving energy, remaining calm. Minds followed suit, settling into patterns that required little effort to maintain. These days passed quietly, supported by routine and familiarity. Food, warmth, and patience worked together to carry people through the long season. Nothing needed to change quickly. Winter remained, and life remained within it, steady and unbroken. As winter deepened, waiting became part of everyday life. Not waiting for something specific, but waiting as a state of being. Time no longer moved through visible change. Days looked much like the days before them, and nights returned with the same quiet certainty. In this environment, patience was not practiced intentionally. It simply developed through repetition. People learned to exist within the cold rather than against it. Movement slowed naturally, conserving warmth and energy. Tasks were done carefully, with minimal effort. Nothing was rushed. Even walking felt measured, each step placed with awareness. The cold encouraged stillness, and stillness became familiar. Inside shelters, the sense of waiting continued. Fires burned low and steady, not flaring brightly. Light remained soft and contained. Shadows stayed close to the walls, shifting only slightly as time passed. People sat or lay quietly, listening to the subtle sounds of their surroundings, the crackle of embers, the quiet movement of air, the occasional adjustment of clothing or position. Conversation, when it occurred, was gentle and brief. Words were used sparingly, not because speech was avoided, but because silence felt natural. There was no need to fill the space. Presence alone was enough. Being together, even without interaction, provided reassurance during the long hours. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Snow covered the ground evenly. The horizon stayed pale and distant. Wind passed through without altering the landscape. These unchanging conditions shaped the perception of time. Without visible progress or transition, moments blended together. Hours passed without notice. This waiting was not empty. It was filled with small awarenesses, the sensation of warmth near the fire, the feeling of layered clothing settling into place, the sound of breathing, steady and calm. These details anchored people in the present moment, allowing time to pass without resistance. Over many winters, this pattern repeated. Waiting became as routine as any task. It was not marked or acknowledged. It simply existed, woven into the fabric of daily life. The cold continued, and people continued with it, moving slowly, resting often, and allowing time to pass as it always had. Even during the deepest winter, routines remained important. Not rigid schedules, but familiar sequences of action that brought comfort through repetition. These routines did not change often, and when they did, the changes were gradual. Familiarity provided stability when the outside world offered little variation. Daily tasks were simple and repeated. Fires were checked regularly. Clothing was adjusted and repaired. Food was prepared in careful stages, using methods refined over many seasons. Each action followed the one before it, forming a rhythm that required little thought. The body remembered what to do. Morning and evening held similar qualities during winter. Light did not vary dramatically, and the passage of time was felt more internally than observed. Still, routines created a sense of progression. There was a time for tending the fire, a time for eating, a time for rest. These moments followed one another gently, without urgency. Inside shared spaces, routines overlapped. One person's movement became part of another's awareness. The repetition of these shared patterns created a quiet harmony. No coordination was necessary. Each person moved in familiar ways, shaped by long experience. Maintaining these routines was not about efficiency. It was about continuity. Repeating the same actions reassured people that life was continuing as expected. Even as the cold remained constant, the rhythm of daily activity offered subtle variation. Small differences in sound, light, and movement provided enough change to keep time flowing. Rest was included naturally within these routines. Periods of activity were followed by stillness, sitting quietly near warmth, lying down fully clothed, allowing the body to recover before continuing. Rest was not separate from work. It was part of the same cycle. Through repetition, these routines became almost invisible. They required no planning or reflection. Life moved forward gently, supported by habits that had been shaped over many winters. The cold persisted, but so did familiarity. And within that familiarity, people found a steady way to continue, day after day, without disruption. As winter continued, time was experienced less as a sequence of events and more as a state of being. Days did not feel separate from one another. They blended together, shaped by the same light, the same temperatures, the same routines repeated quietly. People did not count how many days had passed. They noticed instead how the body felt, how the air sounded, how the surroundings remained steady and unchanged. Much of each day involved waiting without impatience, waiting for light to shift slightly, waiting for warmth to settle near the body, waiting for others to finish small tasks before beginning the next. This waiting was not empty. It was filled with awareness, with observation, with stillness that felt familiar rather than uncomfortable. Inside shelters, movement was deliberate and minimal. People learned to pause between actions, conserving energy not through calculation but through habit. A task would be done, then there would be a pause. Another task might follow, or it might wait. There was no urgency to fill every moment. Conversation appeared softly, often brief and unstructured. Words were used when needed, then allowed to fade. Silence was not treated as absence. It was simply part of the environment, as present as the walls and the air within them. Light, when it appeared, was watched gently, not studied, not measured, but noticed. A slight brightening might signal a shift in the day. A subtle dimming suggested rest was near again. These changes guided behavior more than any spoken plan. People adjusted their positions frequently, seeking comfort rather than productivity. Sitting, standing, or lying down happened without explanation. The body was trusted to know what it needed next. Over time, this trust became instinctive. Outside, the landscape remained largely unchanged. Snow covered familiar paths. Wind shaped surfaces slowly. Nothing dramatic occurred. This consistency reinforced a sense of stability, even as the season continued. Waiting became a skill. Not waiting for something specific, but waiting within the day itself. Allowing time to pass without resistance. Accepting that the pace would remain slow, and that nothing needed to interrupt it. In this way, the winter day was not something to endure. It was something to inhabit quietly, moment by moment, without expectation of change. Throughout the winter, small movements shaped daily life more than large actions ever could. These movements were subtle and repeated often, adjusting clothing, shifting position, reaching for a familiar object. Each motion required little energy, yet each played a role in maintaining comfort and continuity. People became highly aware of their own movements, not through conscious thought, but through repetition. They learned how much effort was needed for each action and avoided unnecessary motion. This awareness developed slowly, becoming part of the body's natural response to the environment. Tasks were broken into small steps without deliberate planning. A person might prepare materials slowly, then pause. Another might take over quietly, continuing where the last left off. There was no need for instruction or explanation. Shared understanding guided these transitions. Hands remained active even when the rest of the body was still. Simple actions like sorting, repairing, or holding objects helped maintain warmth and focus. These movements were gentle and unhurried, designed to sustain rather than exhaust. Food-related tasks followed the same pattern. Preparation was gradual. Eating was slow. Cleanup happened naturally, without clear boundaries. Each step blended into the next, forming a continuous flow rather than a sequence of separate actions. Rest appeared frequently, often without being named. A person might sit quietly, eyes unfocused, listening to the subtle sounds around them. Breathing slowed. Muscles released tension gradually. This rest was not scheduled. It happened when needed. Even interactions between people followed this rhythm. A glance, a small gesture, a brief exchange of words. These moments passed easily, leaving no sense of interruption. Togetherness was expressed through presence rather than activity. Outside sounds, when present, were muted and distant. Wind moved across snow. Ice shifted slightly. These sounds blended into the background, reinforcing the steady pace of the day. Over time, these small movements formed the structure of daily life. They replaced large goals or plans. They provided rhythm, comfort, and continuity. Winter was navigated not through force or urgency, but through these gentle, repeated actions that allowed life to continue quietly, one moment at a time. As winter continued, days became less distinct from one another. The absence of strong daylight softened the sense of passing time, allowing routines to repeat without interruption. People did not mark progress by dates or milestones, but by familiarity. What mattered was that the day unfolded in the same way it had before, and would again. Inside shelters, movement followed established paths. Hands reached for the same tools, the same containers, the same materials. These actions required little attention. They had been practiced so often that they no longer needed instruction. The body remembered where to go and what to do, even when the outside world remained quiet and unchanged. Much of the day was spent maintaining warmth. This did not mean constant effort, but steady awareness. Fires were tended gently, adjusted rather than rebuilt. Fuel was added slowly, allowing heat to remain even rather than intense. Warmth was something to preserve, not consume. People often stayed close to one another, sharing space without conversation. Proximity provided reassurance, a reminder that life continued beyond the stillness of winter. Silence was not empty. It was filled with presence, with breathing, with the soft sounds of movement. Clothing was adjusted throughout the day, not changed entirely. Layers were shifted, loosened, or tightened as needed. These small movements helped maintain comfort without disrupting routine. There was no urgency in these adjustments. They happened naturally, guided by sensation rather than thought. Food preparation during this period followed a familiar rhythm. Meals were not elaborate, nor were they varied. What mattered was consistency. The same ingredients appeared again and again, prepared in the same ways. This repetition reduced effort and allowed the mind to remain calm. Eating took place slowly, often without conversation. The act itself was grounding, reinforcing the sense of continuity. Hunger was addressed gently, without excess. Food was something to rely on, not something to anticipate. Outside, the environment remained largely unchanged. Snow settled and resettled. Wind altered its shape slightly, but did not transform it. The landscape felt stable, even when harsh. This stability was important. It allowed people to orient themselves without visual markers. When venturing outdoors, movement was deliberate and minimal. Paths were followed carefully, often retracing the same routes. These paths became familiar through repetition, even when covered or obscured. Memory guided each step. Returning indoors was not treated as relief, but as continuation. Inside and outside were parts of the same routine, each requiring different forms of attention. Neither was more important than the other. Both were approached calmly. As the day progressed, activity remained steady. There were no peaks or declines. Effort was distributed evenly, allowing energy to last through long periods without strain. This balance was learned over time, shaped by necessity rather than choice. As night approached, there was little difference from earlier hours. Darkness did not signal an ending. It simply deepened what was already present. Fires continued to burn quietly. Bodies remained close. Life moved forward without announcement. During extended winter periods, waiting became part of daily life. Not waiting for a specific event, but waiting as a condition. Time stretched gently, without clear divisions, allowing routines to repeat without interruption. This waiting was not uncomfortable. It was familiar. Inside shelters, the atmosphere remained steady. Light sources were kept low and consistent, preventing sharp contrasts. Shadows remained soft, shifting slowly as flames moved. This gentle lighting supported calm, allowing eyes to rest rather than adjust constantly. People occupied themselves with small tasks that required little concentration. Hands worked while the mind remained at ease. These tasks were often repeated many times, not because they were necessary each time, but because they provided structure. Repetition filled the hours without demanding attention. Conversation, when it occurred, was quiet and unhurried. Words were not used to pass time, but to acknowledge presence. Silence followed naturally, without discomfort. Listening became as common as speaking. Clothing and bedding were arranged to preserve warmth throughout rest periods. These materials were familiar, shaped by long use. Their textures were known, offering reassurance through touch. Adjustments were made slowly, guided by comfort rather than precision. Sleep did not occur all at once. Rest and wakefulness blended together. People rested when they felt tired and rose when they felt ready. There was no expectation of uninterrupted sleep. The body adjusted naturally, moving between states without effort. Fire maintenance remained an ongoing task, approached gently. Flames were not encouraged to grow large. Instead, they were kept stable, providing consistent warmth. Watching the fire became a quiet activity, requiring no outcome. Food stores were checked occasionally, not out of concern, but out of habit. Knowing what was available reinforced a sense of continuity. Nothing needed to change. Supplies were used carefully, as they had always been. Outside sounds were minimal. Wind passed over structures. Snow shifted slightly. These sounds blended into the background, becoming part of the atmosphere rather than distractions. The environment remained present without demanding attention. Movement outdoors remained limited, but necessary. When it occurred, it followed known patterns. The body moved carefully, conserving energy. Each return indoors was smooth, without urgency. As hours passed, the distinction between day and night remained subtle. Darkness deepened gradually, but life continued unchanged. There was no moment that marked transition. Everything flowed evenly, supported by routine. The long winter did not feel endless when approached this way. By focusing on the immediate moment, on the repetition of small actions, time became manageable. Days passed not as obstacles, but as continuations of what had already been. Rest arrived gently, without instruction. The body settled into familiar positions. Breathing slowed naturally. The environment remained steady, allowing sleep to come and go without disruption. And as winter continued, life remained present within it, moving forward quietly, sustained by routine, patience, and calm repetition. As winter continued, waiting became part of daily life. Not waiting for a specific moment, and not waiting for change, but waiting as a steady condition that shaped every hour. The cold did not arrive suddenly anymore. It had already settled, and now it remained, quiet and unmoving, stretching across days that felt similar to one another. People adjusted to this state slowly. They did not measure how long the cold would last. They focused instead on what could be done today, and then again tomorrow. The body learned how to remain still without growing tense, how to move only when needed, and how to conserve warmth through calmness rather than effort. Inside shared spaces, time passed gently. Small tasks filled the hours, not because they were urgent, but because they provided structure. Tools were checked again, even if they had already been checked before. Supplies were arranged, then rearranged, not to improve them, but to stay connected to their presence. Outside, the world remained quiet. Snow softened edges and absorbed sound. Wind moved across open land without resistance, shaping the surface slowly, without direction or goal. These changes were noticed, but not reacted to. They became part of the background, like breathing. Conversation, when it happened, was unhurried. Words were chosen carefully, not for meaning, but for rhythm. Silence returned icily, without discomfort. There was no pressure to fill the space. Waiting did not feel empty. It felt full of repetition. The body responded to this environment by slowing. Movements became deliberate. Energy was preserved not through planning, but through habit. The cold encouraged stillness, and stillness became familiar. Food was consumed steadily, not to prepare for anything, but to maintain balance. Warmth came gradually, held carefully, allowed to remain rather than escape. Fire, if present, was tended patiently, never hurried. Night and day continued to alternate, even when light was scarce. The difference was subtle, often felt more than seen. The body adjusted its rhythm to this quiet cycle, resting when possible, waking gently when needed. Waiting became woven into everything. It did not signal delay or absence. It was simply how time moved during winter, slow and continuous, without clear direction. And within this waiting, life remained steady, held together by small routines repeated again and again. During the long winter, movement changed its meaning. There was little reason to travel far, and little benefit in unnecessary motion. Instead, movement became contained, limited to small spaces and familiar paths. The body learned how to exist within boundaries without feeling confined. Inside shelters, movement followed patterns that repeated daily: sitting, standing, shifting position, adjusting clothing. These actions were subtle and quiet, barely noticeable, yet essential. Each movement was measured, not in distance, but in purpose. Outside, when movement was necessary, it was careful and brief. Steps were placed deliberately. The ground was read slowly, observing texture and resistance. The cold shaped how the body moved, encouraging efficiency rather than speed. There was no wandering. Every action had a reason, even if that reason was simply to check, to observe, or to maintain familiarity. Movement did not seek progress. It maintained connection. Returning indoors felt natural. Warmth was welcomed gradually, not rushed. The body adjusted slowly, releasing tension at its own pace. Stillness returned easily. Within shared spaces, people moved around one another with awareness. Paths were understood without being marked. Each person learned how to occupy space without disruption, how to pass quietly, how to remain present without drawing attention. Movement during winter was not about reaching new places. It was about maintaining balance within known ones. The same areas were crossed many times, each passage reinforcing familiarity and comfort. Even small tasks required motion: reaching, lifting, arranging, settling. These movements provided rhythm to the day, breaking long periods of stillness without disturbing calm. The cold encouraged this kind of movement, slow and intentional. Sudden actions were avoided, not because they were forbidden, but because they felt unnecessary. The body learned patience through repetition. Over time, this way of moving became instinctive. There was no need to think about it. The environment guided the body, and the body responded without resistance. Winter did not stop movement. It reshaped it, drawing it inward, shortening distances, and allowing life to continue quietly within a smaller, steadier world. And within that world, movement remained gentle, purposeful, and calm. As the long winter continued, people became deeply familiar with waiting. Not the kind of waiting that expected something new, but the kind that simply existed alongside time itself. Days passed quietly, marked not by events, but by the same routines returning again and again, unchanged. Inside sheltered spaces, the air remained still and heavy with warmth that had been carefully preserved. Light entered only briefly, and when it did, it moved slowly across surfaces that had not changed in weeks. Walls looked the same. Tools rested in the same places. The arrangement of daily life remained steady, offering reassurance through its sameness. People adjusted their expectations during this part of winter. There was no anticipation of change. Instead, there was acceptance. The season was not something to move through quickly. It was something to remain within, patiently and without resistance. Time did not need to be filled. It only needed to pass. Movement during these days was minimal. When people rose, they did so slowly, conserving energy without conscious effort. Each action followed another in a familiar sequence: preparing food, adjusting clothing, tending small tasks that required attention but not urgency. These movements were not hurried, and they were not delayed. They occurred when needed and ended when complete. Conversation, when it happened, was soft and brief. Words were chosen carefully, not to communicate urgency, but to acknowledge presence. Silence often returned naturally, filling the space without discomfort. Being together did not require constant interaction. Shared quiet was enough. The outside world remained distant during this time. Wind moved across frozen ground. Snow settled into familiar shapes. These changes were noticed, but they did not alter daily routine. The environment continued its slow patterns, just as people did inside. Light, when present, was subdued. It reflected gently off pale surfaces, offering a brief reminder of the world beyond shelter. But even light did not change behavior. It arrived, lingered briefly, and faded again, leaving the interior unchanged. Tools were handled with care. Materials were reused. Nothing was wasted. Each object held importance simply because it remained available. Repair and adjustment were ongoing, not dramatic. A loose binding tightened, a surface smoothed. These small actions supported continuity rather than progress. As hours passed, there was no clear distinction between one part of the day and the next. Time stretched evenly, without markers. People learned to live within this steady flow, allowing their bodies and minds to adapt naturally. Fatigue did not build sharply. It settled gently, guiding rest when needed. Rest itself did not always mean sleep. Sometimes it meant stillness, sitting quietly, breathing slowly, allowing warmth to settle into the body. These moments were as important as activity, maintaining balance without effort. Winter at this stage was no longer something to endure. It had become the normal state of life. There was no countdown to its end. There was only the present moment, repeating softly, carrying people forward without requiring attention. As the winter settled deeper, the sense of routine became even more pronounced. Familiar actions no longer felt like choices. They felt automatic, shaped by weeks of repetition. Life moved forward without decision, guided by habits that had proven reliable across many seasons. Inside shared spaces, people occupied their surroundings with quiet confidence. They knew where warmth gathered, where light lingered longest, where tools could be reached without searching. This familiarity reduced effort, allowing energy to be preserved without conscious planning. Clothing was adjusted instinctively. Layers were added or loosened with small movements that barely interrupted the flow of the day. There was no need to check conditions outside. The body recognized what was required and responded accordingly. Food preparation followed a steady rhythm. Ingredients were measured by experience rather than by tools. Portions were consistent, shaped by necessity and familiarity. Eating was slow, not because of scarcity alone, but because there was no reason to hurry. Meals offered warmth and continuity rather than variety. Between these moments, stillness returned. People rested in place, aware of one another without constant interaction. The shared environment created a sense of quiet stability. Nothing needed to be changed. Nothing needed to be improved. Outside, the landscape remained frozen and unmoving. Snow covered the ground evenly. Ice held its shape. Wind passed across the surface without altering it. These conditions were accepted as part of the season's rhythm, neither feared nor challenged. Light continued its brief appearances. When it arrived, it revealed familiar details and then faded again. The passing of daylight did not create urgency. It simply marked another cycle, completed, another repetition within the larger pattern of winter. Small tasks filled the hours gently, sorting materials, adjusting equipment, maintaining order within limited space. These actions did not accumulate toward a goal. They supported the present moment, ensuring that daily life could continue without disruption. Voices, when heard, remained calm and unhurried. Conversation often revisited familiar topics, not to exchange information, but to reinforce connection. Stories were repeated softly, their details already known. The comfort came from repetition itself, not from novelty. As the day moved toward rest, there was no clear transition. Activity slowed naturally. Bodies settled into positions that felt familiar and supportive. Warmth was maintained carefully, without excess. The space held stillness easily. Sleep, when it came, was gradual. It was not summoned or forced. It arrived as part of the ongoing rhythm, just another phase within the long cycle of winter days and nights. Dreams, if they appeared, blended gently with waking awareness. Through all of this, there was no sense of isolation. The presence of others, the familiarity of routine, and the steadiness of the environment created quiet reassurance. Life continued not through change, but through consistency. Winter did not need to be overcome. It needed to be lived within. And in doing so, people allowed time to pass naturally, one calm moment at a time. By the time winter reached its deepest point, life had settled into a steady, unchanging rhythm. Days no longer felt distinct from one another. Light, when it appeared, did so briefly and without ceremony. Darkness returned calmly, without resistance. The passage of time was no longer measured by dates or markers, but by familiarity. People woke when they woke, often without knowing precisely how long they had slept. Rest came in segments, shaped by warmth, quiet, and the gentle presence of others nearby. There was no expectation that sleep follow a strict pattern. It adjusted naturally to the conditions of the season. Inside sheltered spaces, the air remained still and contained. Walls held warmth carefully. Small sounds carried clearly in the quiet. The soft movement of clothing, the settling of materials, the faint sound of breath. These sounds were not interruptions. They were reassurances that life continued. Movement during these days was minimal and deliberate. Each action served a purpose, but none were rushed. Fuel was added carefully. Food was prepared slowly. Tools were handled with familiarity rather than focus. The body conserved energy instinctively, without conscious effort. Conversation, when it occurred, remained calm and unhurried. Words were chosen gently, often repeating what had already been said before. There was no need to introduce new topics. Familiar thoughts returned again and again, offering comfort through repetition. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged. Snow held its shape. Ice reflected the same muted light day after day. Wind passed across the surface without altering its form. The world felt suspended, not moving forward, but holding steady. People rarely looked far ahead during this time. Planning extended only as far as the next task, the next meal, the next moment of warmth. The future did not press for attention. The present was enough. Clothing was adjusted repeatedly throughout the day. Layers were loosened, tightened, added, or removed in response to subtle changes in temperature. These adjustments were made without thought, guided by long familiarity with the cold. Food was eaten slowly, often in silence. The body accepted nourishment patiently, without urgency. Warmth spread gradually, settling rather than surging. Meals did not break the rhythm of the day. They blended into it. As hours passed, rest returned naturally. Sitting became stillness. Stillness became sleep. Sleep gave way to waking again, without clear boundaries between one state and the next. The cycle continued quietly. In this deep winter period, survival did not feel dramatic. It felt steady. It felt ordinary. Life continued not through effort or struggle, but through consistency and calm persistence. During the longer stretches of winter, shared presence became one of the most important elements of daily life. People spent many hours close to one another, not out of necessity alone, but because closeness offered reassurance. The simple awareness of others nearby made the long season feel manageable. There was no constant interaction. Silence filled much of the time. This silence was not empty. It was comfortable, familiar, and expected. It allowed each person to remain aware without needing to respond. Bodies learned to occupy space together without tension. Movements were small and careful. A shift in position, a quiet step, a brief adjustment of clothing. Each action was made with awareness of others, without discussion. Stories, when told, were familiar ones. The same narratives returned again and again, spoken softly, often without variation. The purpose was not to entertain or inform, but to maintain continuity. Hearing the same words repeated brought comfort rather than boredom. Hands remained busy with simple tasks, repairing, sorting, preparing. These actions provided structure without pressure. They gave the day shape without demanding progress. Each task could be paused and resumed without consequence. Children, elders, and adults shared the same space, each adapting to the rhythm in their own way. Activity levels differed, but the overall pace remained slow. There was no expectation that everyone move or rest at the same time. Light sources were used carefully. Flames were kept low. Reflections moved gently across surfaces, creating a sense of motion without change. The environment remained soft and contained. Outside sounds were rare. Wind occasionally brushed against structures. Snow shifted subtly. These sounds were distant and muted, reminding those inside that the world continued beyond the walls. As days passed, the body adjusted fully to the season. Cold no longer felt sharp. Darkness no longer felt heavy. These conditions became familiar, predictable, and manageable. Rest came often, not always as deep sleep, but as quiet awareness. Eyes closed, breathing slowed. The body remained still while the mind drifted gently, unanchored by urgency. In this way, endurance did not feel like effort. It felt like continuation. Each day resembled the one before, and that sameness offered stability rather than monotony. Winter did not need to be conquered or overcome. It simply needed to be lived within, patiently and quietly, until the gradual return of light made itself known in its own time. As winter continued, time itself felt less defined. Days did not separate cleanly from one another. Instead, they blended into a single extended season of stillness, repetition, and quiet endurance. In Arctic communities, this was not experienced as hardship alone, but as a familiar state that returned each year, expected and understood. Movement remained minimal. People conserved energy not through conscious effort, but through habit formed over generations. Tasks were completed slowly, often with pauses between motions, allowing the body to remain warm and steady. There was no sense of urgency to complete anything quickly. The winter allowed for patience. Inside sheltered spaces, routines remained largely unchanged. The same areas were used for resting, preparing food, repairing tools, and sharing quiet presence. These spaces did not need constant rearranging. Their familiarity provided comfort, especially during long stretches when the outside world felt distant and unmoving. Light, when present, was subtle. It did not dominate the space. Instead, it softened edges and revealed familiar shapes without drawing attention to itself. Shadows were accepted rather than resisted. Darkness was not an absence, but a condition that shaped how life continued. People often remained seated or lying down for extended periods, adjusting positions slowly when needed. Stillness was not inactivity. It was a form of balance, allowing warmth to remain close and energy to be preserved. Conversations, when they occurred, were unhurried and brief, often fading naturally into silence. The body adapted to this rhythm. Hunger appeared gently rather than sharply. Rest arrived gradually rather than suddenly. Sleep came in phases, sometimes light, sometimes deeper, without fixed schedules. Waking and resting followed the body's cues rather than the clock. Outside, The environment remained unchanged for long stretches. Snow rested where it had fallen. Wind reshaped surfaces subtly over time, but nothing moved quickly. These slow changes were rarely observed directly. They were noticed only after they had already occurred. People did not measure progress through the winter. There was no counting of days until it ended. Instead, life continued within the season itself, shaped by its conditions rather than opposed to them. The focus remained on the present moment, on what could be done comfortably and safely now. Food consumption followed similar patterns. Meals were simple, familiar, and spaced evenly. There was no excess, but also no deprivation. Eating provided warmth and steadiness, rather than satisfaction or variety. The act of preparing food remained calm and predictable. Over time, these routines created a sense of continuity. The winter did not feel endless, because it was not treated as something to endure moment by moment. It was lived within, slowly and evenly, without expectation of sudden change. This way of existing allowed communities to remain steady even when conditions were harsh. By reducing unnecessary movement, simplifying routines, and maintaining familiarity, life continued quietly, held together by repetition and patience. As winter progressed further, the concept of waiting took on a different meaning. It was not a passive act, nor was it filled with anticipation. Waiting became simply another state of being, one that required no effort and no attention. Life did not pause. It continued quietly within that stillness. People spent long periods simply existing within their spaces. Hands rested, eyes adjusted to low light. Breathing remained slow and steady. These moments were not marked as rest or inactivity. They were simply part of the rhythm that winter required. Small tasks filled the time gently. Tools were checked, handled, and set down again. Clothing was adjusted or repaired in small ways, not because it urgently needed to be, but because familiarity encouraged care. These actions provided structure without demanding focus. Sound remained minimal. When it appeared, it was soft and brief. The movement of fabric, the contact of hands with surfaces, the quiet presence of others nearby. These sounds reassured rather than distracted, confirming that life continued as expected. Social interaction remained understated. People were aware of one another without constant communication. Presence alone was enough. The closeness of shared spaces created a sense of connection that did not rely on conversation or activity. Sleep continued to arrive in cycles. Some rested for long periods, others in shorter intervals. The body adjusted naturally, responding to warmth, light, and comfort rather than timekeeping. Waking did not signal the start of a new day, only a shift in awareness. Outside conditions remained largely unchanged. The environment offered no cues for progress or transition. Instead, it reinforced the sense of continuity. Snow, ice, and darkness created a stable backdrop against which life unfolded quietly. People did not resist this sameness. It was expected and familiar. Over generations, communities learned that stability during winter came not from change, but from consistency. By keeping routines simple and predictable, mental and physical balance was maintained. Food continued to be prepared and consumed at a steady pace. Portions remained modest. Warmth mattered more than variety. The act of eating served as both nourishment and reassurance, reinforcing the sense that resources were sufficient and life remained secure. As time passed, the winter did not feel shorter or longer. It simply existed, and people existed within it. There was no need to imagine what came next. The present moment was enough. Eventually, subtle changes would come, though they were not yet noticeable. For now, the rhythm remained unchanged. Life continued quietly, shaped by stillness, repetition, and the steady presence of the season. By the time the deepest part of winter arrived, there was little sense of beginning or ending left in the days. Time did not move forward in obvious steps. Instead, it spread outward, wide and quiet, filling each moment with the same still presence. The outside world remained unchanged for long stretches, and inside, life adjusted to that sameness. People did not count how many days had passed since the last clear sky or the last brief return of light. Instead, they measured time by routines that repeated steadily. Fires were tended. Food was prepared slowly. Tools were checked and set aside again. These actions created markers that replaced calendars and clocks, giving shape to time without dividing it sharply. Movement was deliberate. Energy was conserved without being discussed. Bodies learned to move only as much as necessary, not from effort, but from familiarity with the season. Sitting, standing, and resting blended into one another. Stillness became a normal state rather than an absence of activity. Inside shelters, sounds remained soft and predictable. The crackle of fire, the quiet shifting of clothing, the low movement of breath. These sounds did not interrupt the silence. They became part of it, forming a steady background that reassured rather than distracted. Conversations, when they happened, were slow and brief. Words were chosen carefully, not for meaning, but for ease. Long silences were common and comfortable. No one felt pressure to fill the space. The presence of others was enough. Light remained limited, but it was used thoughtfully. Small flames or dim lamps shaped the interior gently, creating areas of warmth rather than brightness. Shadows were accepted as part of the space, not something to push away. The eye adjusted, and with it, attention softened. Daily tasks continued even when they felt repetitive. Food was prepared the same way. Clothing was adjusted in familiar patterns. Small repairs were made when needed, not to improve things, but to maintain them. These actions reinforced a sense of continuity, reminding everyone that life had not stopped, only slowed. Waiting became part of living, not waiting for something specific, but waiting in general. Waiting while the fire warmed the space, waiting while food finished cooking, waiting while the outside world remained quiet and unchanged. This waiting did not create tension, it simply existed. Over time, The mind adjusted to this pace. Thoughts became fewer and less urgent. Attention drifted easily, settling on small details or passing sensations. The body followed, relaxing into a rhythm that required little effort. Winter did not feel like something to overcome. It felt like something to move within. Each day resembled the last closely enough that there was no need to track them individually. Life continued, steady and contained, held gently within the long middle of the season. As winter continued, there was no clear moment when people felt they had reached its end, nor did they search for one. Life was not arranged around conclusions. It was arranged around continuation. Each day followed the previous one closely, shaped by the same quiet patterns that had already proven reliable. The outside world remained still for long periods, and inside, routines held everything together. Fires were maintained carefully, not rushed, not neglected. Food was shared in the same calm way it always had been. Rest came when it was needed, without ceremony or expectation. Sleep arrived gradually each night, not as a destination, but as a soft transition. Bodies settled when they were ready. Breath slowed. Awareness loosened. There was no need to mark the moment when waking gave way to rest. It happened naturally, just as it always had. Even as winter stretched on, there was no sense of time being lost. The days were not empty. They were full of small repetitions that gave shape to experience. These repetitions did not demand attention. They allowed the mind to drift, to release its need to anticipate what came next. Light returned slowly when it returned at all, and when it did, it was received without celebration. It simply became part of the environment again, adding to what was already familiar. Darkness and light existed together, neither one interrupting the rhythm of life. People remained attentive to one another without effort. Presence mattered more than interaction. Sitting together, sharing space, and moving quietly within the same shelter created a sense of stability that did not depend on words. The season did not ask to be understood. It asked only to be lived through, moment by moment, with patience and consistency. Life adjusted itself gently, conserving energy, maintaining warmth, and allowing time to pass without resistance. And so the days continued, blending softly into one another. There was no final lesson to draw, no conclusion to reach, only the steady presence of routine, stillness, and care, repeating quietly. As this telling continues, there is no need to remain focused. You may listen, or you may let the words drift into the background. The rhythm remains the same, calm and unbroken, carrying life forward gently, without asking for attention, without requiring an ending.